Hey everybody, let's talk Portuguese. Today's video is going to be all about the influences of African languages on Portuguese. Before we get into today's video, if you didn't know already, I have set up a Discord server. Discord is, of course, an app where you can chat with people who share common interests on dedicated servers, so I have set one up for the channel. So whether you're interested in improving your Portuguese or your English, or just talking further in depth about the topics of my videos, Portuguese, linguistics, or other cultural topics in general, feel more than welcome to come join us on the Discord. There is an invite link in the description of my videos as well as directly on my channel, and once you're there, there are some instructions on how to get started chatting. So I look forward to chatting with you on Discord. Also, if you're enjoying the videos that I make on my channel and you'd like to support me more directly, you can do so on Patreon. Patreon is a place where you can buy me a coffee each month, and in return you get access to exclusive extras. Those extras include a patrons-only channel on the Discord where you can chat directly with me and other patrons, as well as things like knowing about what I'm working on next first, sources and other materials that I find in my research for my videos, as well as fun things like postcards from me to you. So if that sounds interesting to you, head on over to patreon.com/Sasha where you can find out all of the details. Now, let's get back to the video. Today's video is going to be all about the influence of African languages on Portuguese. I did a video recently about the influences of indigenous languages on Portuguese. But as I was doing that video, it occurred to me that I could not overlook the influence of African languages on Portuguese. Whether we're talking about Brazilian Portuguese, European Portuguese, or the African varieties of Portuguese themselves, African languages have had a strong influence on Portuguese across history. European Portuguese has words of African origin in day-to-day speech, whereas Brazilian Portuguese has had a more profound influence from African languages. This is also to go without saying that the African varieties of Portuguese have also been heavily influenced by local African languages. So fundamentally, when we're talking about the influence of African languages on Portuguese, we're talking about two main things. We're talking about the Portuguese history of colonialism and the slave trade that would lead to many Africans being shipped to Brazil over time, and the historical linguistic impact that that had on Brazilian Portuguese. And we're also talking about more modern and recent developments in African varieties of Portuguese. Both Angola and Mozambique have more recent histories of adopting Portuguese. They were colonized by the Portuguese later, and widespread adoption of Portuguese wouldn't happen until much later as well. In Angola, most of the population already speaks Portuguese, and a significant portion of that population speaks Portuguese as a native language. In Mozambique, about half of the population speaks Portuguese, and a smaller percentage of that population speaks Portuguese natively. What this means is that in both Angola and Mozambique, there is a significant proportion of the population that speaks Portuguese as a second language. We know in linguistics that there is a critical period of language acquisition that lasts until about our adolescence. In this period of language acquisition, we're able to learn languages with all of their aspects without very much interference. If you want to learn a language and have a perfect accent, the best way to do so is simply to learn that language before you hit adolescence. And that concept can be extended to other linguistic elements. But obviously, most of the speakers of Portuguese as a second language in those countries did not learn the language when they were children. What this leads to is an interference in their native language on their learning of Portuguese. This is a natural linguistic phenomenon, and it can happen with any two given languages. Whatever language you speak natively from an early age will go on to influence the languages that you're learning as an adult learner. This can manifest itself in a lot of different ways, such as pronunciation and grammatical habits. Part of this is because we tend to apply the grammatical logic of our native language to the new language that we're learning, whether we do it in a conscious or subconscious manner. And this is the fundamental nature of how languages influence each other. So when we're talking about African language influences on Portuguese, this is the process by which it happened. In the case of Brazil, this happened over hundreds of years, and in Angola and Mozambique, this is a much more recent phenomenon. One of the most common ways that languages influence each other is through vocabulary. But when we talk about African languages, we have to specify which African languages we're talking about. After all, Africa is a very large continent, and the Portuguese were only in contact with a certain specific part of it over time. Historically, this means the west coast of Africa. The languages that the Portuguese came into most contact with were the Kwa languages of Western Africa, Yoruba, and Bantu languages. Bantu is a very large language language family. There is no one single Bantu language. So when we refer to Bantu language influence on Portuguese, especially in a Brazilian Portuguese context, we're actually referring to the Bantu languages of Angola. The most prominent by number of speakers of those languages are Umbundu, Kimbundu, and Kikongo. There are, of course, many others that Portuguese came into contact with that would have had some level of influence on it, but those are the primary languages that we're referring to. Mozambican languages historically did not exert that much influence over Brazilian Portuguese because the Portuguese colonization of Mozambique came much later. That being said, the Bantu language family, much like the Romance language family, exhibits quite a lot of grammatical regularity. The grammars of each Bantu language have a fairly similar logic in the same way that the grammars of each Romance language have a fairly similar logic to them. So in all three of these countries, Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique, we can observe similar patterns of grammatical influence. But the most common form of linguistic influence is in fact in vocabulary. Languages borrow and naturalize words from one another all the time. There are no major languages on the planet that don't have any borrowed words. Word borrowings happen for a lot of different reasons, whether they be cultural, technological, religious, and so on. And that is no less the case when we're talking about African languages and Portuguese. Much more so than indigenous languages, African languages have left their mark on Portuguese. There are lots of words within African origin in use across all of the Lusophonia. Lots of these words are in general use. If you've ever used a carimbo or heard of a zumbi, you have used an African word. Portugal has taken on a relatively smaller amount of these words, including words like bazar and bue, which have their origins in Angola. And Brazil has quite a lot of lexical borrowings. Lots of words that we think of as being typically Brazilian are in fact African in origin. If you've ever heard of the terms cafuné, cochilar, samba, fofoca, moleque, and so on, you have heard a word with an African origin. This of course leads to a lot of words having false etymologies, or African etymologies applied to words that are unverifiable. I'm not going to get too far into the specific vocabularies of Angola and Mozambique, and the African words borrowed and normalized into those varieties of Portuguese, because I would like to take the time and dedicate specific videos to both of those varieties of Portuguese in the future. Although there is a significant presence of Yoruba in Brazil, Yoruba has mostly contributed lexical items to Brazilian Portuguese. Those include words for religious ceremonies, gastronomy, and other cultural elements. The primary source of influence on Portuguese, however, is from the Bantu languages. The Bantu languages have given the popular registers of speech in Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique quite a lot of grammatical influences. Because of the similarities in the grammatical logic of the Bantu languages, these grammatical influences can be heard in all three of these countries. But before we get into these grammatical influences, I want to take a moment to talk about prescriptivism versus descriptivism in linguistics. As you should know by now, my channel is dedicated to Portuguese linguistics. I'm here to talk about Portuguese in all of its many varieties and all of the little quirks that it can have in all of the different places where it is spoken. That, in its approach, is fundamentally descriptive. And the descriptive approach is the primary approach used in the science of linguistics. Linguistics seeks to describe and understand the workings of language. Prescriptivism, on the other hand, is what we think of when we think of grammarians and the academies of language that regulate the normative standard. Fundamentally, the normative standard of any given language is a relatively artificial construct of that language in order to guide speakers into speaking in a more uniform way. So normative standards of language have a very useful place in language, and prescriptivism does have its place. That place, however, is not here. And the reason I bring this up is because we often look at language through the lens of correct versus incorrect, when linguistically speaking, that concept doesn't exist. Linguistics concerns itself mostly with grammatical logic, not grammatical rules set by a normative standard. And this is no less the case when we're talking about Portuguese. Many of the Bantu grammatical influences on Portuguese, because they deviate so far from the normative standard, are seen as highly bastardized versions of Portuguese, to put it lightly. In all three countries, Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique, most of these forms of speech are considered substandard. They are considered bad Portuguese, despite the fact that, linguistically speaking, they operate with consistent, systematic, grammatical logic. So this is something to keep in mind when we're talking about these things. In much the same way as there doesn't exist any one single pure form of Portuguese, we have to understand that correctness in Portuguese, as with any other language, exists on a spectrum. And African influences on Portuguese grammar also exist on a spectrum. In the case of Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique, speakers who have higher degrees of education tend to speak in a way that matches more closely to the normative standard, whereas those who are less educated or learn the language as an adult tend to speak more in accordance with African patterns of grammar. In Brazil, this historically derives from the slave trade and the enslaved population that made its way to the country. Given the great number of enslaved people who ended up in Brazil, these patterns of speech generalized over time. They would go on to be adopted in a general manner across many different social classes. So let's get into some of these inner grammatical workings. When we talk about these influences on Portuguese, we have to first look at the Bantu grammatical logic. Bantu languages do not work in the same way as Romance languages. They have different grammar and they have different concepts on which they operate in order to express things in their languages. The way Bantu languages mark class is markedly different from the way that Romance languages do so in their own right. In Romance languages, we are used to using suffixes in order to indicate the class of a word. That can be number, whether that's plural or singular, or gender, so we have a distinction based on a root and the suffix in a word. This applies to nouns, and in the case of verbs, we have the root and we have markers for both person and number, whether that's singular or plural, and who exactly is doing the action. This is most readily apparent in the verbal conjugations. We learn a base form and then we apply the verbal conjugations to the end. But Bantu languages mostly use prefixes to mark the class of a word. Because of their extensive use of prefixes and other affixes or other elements introduced into a word, Bantu languages tend not to have a need for prepositions. In Romance languages, we use prepositions extensively. We have words like ang, para, a, and so on. And those prepositions convey significant meaning, which in Bantu languages is reserved to the prefixes or affixes introduced into a word. When talking about Portuguese, there are a lot of ways that this manifests itself. One of the most distinctive elements of popular speech, especially in Brazil, is the dropping of plurals. You'll hear things like os menino or dois carro, where the secondary elements of the nominal phrase lack the plural. This ultimately is the expression of the Bantu grammatical logic applied to Portuguese. Because in the nominal phrase we already have the first element giving us the information that we need about the number involved, according to Bantu grammatical logic, the other elements of the nominal phrase do not need it. And that is how we end up with plural dropping. Word categorizations in Bantu languages are also significantly different than those of Romance languages. Bantu languages tend to categorize words along the lines of animacy or inanimacy. What this means is that grammatically speaking, words take on a different function depending on their category. Functionally, this means that different prefixes and affixes are used with different classes of words. This animate and inanimate distinction is especially important when we think about the phenomenon of lleismo. What lleismo is the substitution of indirect object pronouns in Portuguese with lhe. An example of this would be saying something like lhe vi or vi-lhe instead of viu for I saw him. Lleismo is especially common among second language learners in Angola and Mozambique. But something to take note of is that in Bantu languages, the object of a sentence is marked without a distinction between indirect and direct objects. Instead, they mark an object of a sentence according to its class. This is where the animate versus inanimate distinction comes into play. In Portuguese, this lleismo happens systematically with animate nouns. But in cases where we have an inanimate object, speakers systematically exclude the object pronoun altogether. Bantu languages also have a different locational logic than Romance languages. They account for different things in phrases that have to do with location. One of the most prominent ways that we notice this is the systematic usage of ang instead of making a distinction between ang and a. So you get sentences like ir na casa de alguém instead of ir a casa de alguém. This is because in Bantu languages, there doesn't tend to be a distinction between onde and aonde, or in other words, there is no place versus movement distinction. Instead, in those languages, the grammatically productive and relevant information is in the place. And this allows for sentence structure where the locational topic of a sentence can become the subject. In order to explain this best, we have to look at some of the research done on this matter. One of the most cited works on this is by Charlotte Galvish and Juanito Avelar. falar. And one of the examples that they give is aqueles quartos só cabem uma pessoa. There are a few things that we can notice here. Under the normative standard, we would have a sentence more like só cabe uma pessoa naqueles quartos. The grammatical subject of that sentence would be pessoa, and we would have a preposition indicating place. Instead, following the logic of Bantu grammar, the location is placed at the beginning of the sentence as the marker of the sentence and is transformed into the subject. These types of constructions are very common in Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique, and they come from this Bantu grammatical logic. Those are just some of the ways in which Bantu grammatical logic has influenced the popular speech of Brazil, Angola, and Mozambique. There are, of course, plenty of other examples that can be given, and if you're interested in those, let me know in a comment below. But to round out this video fairly quickly, I wanted to also talk about pronunciation. The syllable structure of Bantu languages is fundamentally consonant-vowel. What this means is that syllables cannot be closed by a consonant in Bantu languages. This is very similar to the indigenous languages of South America, and as I made mention in my video about the influence of indigenous languages on Portuguese, this simple fact probably had an accelerating effect on the insertion of vowels in consonant clusters in Brazilian Portuguese. This is, of course, also something that can be widely heard in Angola and Mozambique. But I dare say that is quite a lot of information for one video. There is, of course, quite a lot that I could talk about grammatical and phonetic influences on Portuguese, and if you're interested in that, let me know in a comment down below, and I will see to making videos about that. So that's all I've got for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, leave me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make lots of videos about the Portuguese language, which you can find directly on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.